I just want to say thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Jenny Forstall. I am a professor in political science and also one of the two faculty co-chairs with my other co-chair, Claire Abernathy, for the Political Engagement Project. So this is the second event in the Political Engagement Project, American Democracy Project's Engage Atlantic City series. And so today we will have three excellent panelists who are here to talk about policy and activism in Atlantic City and beyond, potentially. So we have, I'll introduce them in order. So we have Dr. Michael Rodriguez from Political Science. We have Dr. Cristina Jackson from Sociology Anthropology. And we have Alejandro Landano from, who's a senior in Sociology and Anthropology. So our conversation tonight will cover a wide range of issues. I imagine our panelists will talk about both community and activism, but also race, ethnicity, history, and how policy intersects with all of these things and more. So our panelists will each give remarks, and then we have some questions prepared in advance, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rodriguez.
Okay. I think this is on. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. And I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to find it on here. Here we go. So is it F5 or F11 that does it? Oh, that worked. All right, okay. All right, well, hello, everyone. Or maybe I should say hi, y'all, since I'm going to Texas tomorrow. So I have to sort of, practice, get into it. Unlike my past record of broken promises, I will not promise to be brief, but I will try to be, okay? So let me begin with a very general sketch of the demographic profile of both New Jersey and Atlantic City in terms of immigration. Okay? New Jersey has the interesting designation of being a gateway state. Are you familiar with that category? Anyone? Okay. Along with several other much larger states, it ranks 3rd, 4th, and 5th, respectively, in terms of the percentage of foreign-born residents, the percentage of undocumented immigrants in its workforce, and in terms of the raw number of foreign-born individuals residing in the state. To be a gateway state, you need to have at least 1 million residents that are non-citizens, foreign-born. And New Jersey certainly qualifies. It's one of the larger ones in the country. So as you can see, New Jersey has almost twice the number of foreign-born immigrants than the threshold needed to be considered a gateway state. Now, New Jersey, along with Texas and Florida, is not being impacted as much as the other three states by a demographic trend among immigrants in recent decades, and that is the geographic dispersal of immigrants across the country to non-gateway states. I'm sure you've heard of this, that increasingly, although there's still a flow into the sort of traditional gateway states, increasingly more and more immigrants are also moving into non-gateway states, states that in the past have not integrated many foreign-born residents. Now, unlike the other gateway states, New Jersey is not among the top 10 most populous states. It's 11, or my caveat would be the last time I checked, it was 11th. I think it still is. But it is the most densely populated state, not just among the gateway states, but also in the nation. Because New Jersey is also the smallest of the gateway states in terms of landmass, it ranks number 1, or is first, in terms of foreign-born residents, unauthorized immigrants, and unauthorized workers per square mile. So what about Atlantic City? As you can see, there are 6 different types of gateway cities according to demographers. I would submit to you that Atlantic City qualifies as a minor emerging gateway city, and it has a very fascinating profile. About 1/3 of its 39,000 plus residents are foreign-born compared with a bit more than 1/5 for the entire state. Now, Atlantic City is also experiencing Atlantic County, rather, is experiencing the same kind of dispersal patterns I mentioned earlier in terms of immigrants to other municipalities in the county. So again, it's not just focused in Atlantic City, increasingly to other small municipalities, actually not too far away from here in Galloway. If New Jersey has an extraordinarily high level of population density, again, persons per square mile, Atlantic City has almost twice the state level of population density. After all, it's only a bit over 17 square miles in total for the city, and that would qualify as a fairly tiny ranch in Texas, where I'm from. So very brief comments, so we'll move on to others, and then I'm going to come back and say a few things about sanctuary cities. So let me bring this down.
Okay, is this on? Okay. That was briefer than I thought. Mine is a tad longer.
That's why it's brief.
Not really a tad, but we can go with that. So welcome everyone. My name is Cristina Jackson, and I am an assistant professor of sociology here in the sociology and anthropology program. And I'm happy to talk to you today about some very emerging research, new as of 2018, research around segregation and redlining, particularly in Atlantic City in the north side section of the city. And this is, like I said, it's a very new project that my students have been very central in helping me to form. So literally, you know, the last 2 weeks they've been doing interviews with residents of the north side. They've helped me interview residents about their perspective on the history of the city, perspectives on political engagement, and then community development, and then the future of these neighborhoods. Since being here at Stockton, I've ethnographically been studying and developing a relationship with the African American community in AC through the participation in Black Lives Matter Atlantic City, through being a part of the core team, through helping out with individual matters with residents, speaking on radio shows, being on panels, but also taking my students into the community to learn firsthand from residents themselves. The hope of the larger project is to connect the north side with Black San Francisco, which I studied for my dissertation work, and West Philadelphia, which I'm studying now, to also see the effect that institutional racism has had on the relationship between residents of colors and their environments today. So that's kind of been the larger aim of the project. And I'm mostly interested in looking at the effect that redlining of the 1930s, which I'll lay out in a minute, has had on the neighborhood's condition today. It's been about 80 years later, and what I'll show you is that a lot of these neighborhoods have remained relatively the same. So something's going on here that not only, other researchers have also began to look at. What is kind of keeping these neighborhoods in the way that they are today? So what is redlining? So redlining, if you don't know, is the process of denying services to residents based on their race or ethnicity. This practice went on in the 1930s, and what it did was it really enforced segregation through the form of housing and keeping Blacks and other minorities in their neighborhoods and constrained their choice of housing. This was done by the Homeowners Lenders Corporation, which would create what I call created residential security maps for each of the cities that divided cities and neighborhoods into 4 different grades. And so as you see small, this is actually one of Philadelphia, and I'll show you Atlantic Cities in a minute, but neighborhoods that were graded green and blue were looked at as best or still desirable, and neighborhoods that were graded yellow and red were looked at as definitely declining or hazardous. Those are their terms that they've used. And so what it did was, and again, I'm just focusing on redlining right now. That clearly wasn't the only form of institutional racism. Racial covenants and deeds and other things that went on in New Jersey also was doing that as well, but I wanted to focus on redlining. But what it did is that it associated Black communities and other residents that were affected by this, it associated them with being a financial risk to be disinvested in. So if folks, and I'll share with you some community voices soon, but if folks were trying to obtain loans and they had an address in that redlined area, it would most likely be denied, or it would be charged at a really, really high interest rate. And back then, as they explained to my students, there wasn't like several banks you could shop around to see what you can get the best rate. It was like one bank at the time that would deny residents these type of loans. So not only to move out the neighborhood, but also to rehabilitate your home in the neighborhood. So I mean, it really led to the degradation, disinvestment of these neighborhoods in a really negative way. So like I said, this is a residential map of Philadelphia. I'm going to talk a little bit about de jure and de facto segregation, but first I want to talk about how this legally happened. So this was officially done with the creation of the National Housing Act of 1934, which created the ability to be able to discriminate what banks would grant loans for what families. And again, it wasn't just loans, it was also real estate agencies. So I don't know if you all have seen one visual example of this is Raisin in the Sun. I'm sure you saw the different remakes. The Sidney Poitier one was better than the Puff Daddy one. If you see it, you'll know what I mean. But anyway, it shows a family that was in the inner city that moved out, that tried to move to an all-white neighborhood, and they actually were able to obtain a loan, but when they moved there, a lot of the white residents tried to get them to be able to move out. So again, like even if you couldn't get a loan, or if you were lucky enough to get a loan, there were still other ways to kind of enforce that. So along with that, there's also the GI Bill of 1944. So again, when people fought and came back over, a lot of the white soldiers would have a lot of different type of benefits, but one of them was housing assistance and down payment assistance that Black residents didn't have that fought as well. And it became legally outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So quite a long while that this was going on in different ways in different cities. But what it did, which caught me off guard, typical ethnographic research, is that residents speak very positively about the North Side, right? I was like, oh, that's such a shame that happened. But as I'll share with you, residents spoke very positively about living in this neighborhood because they felt that it was a self-sustaining community, that they saw Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black dentists. Ralph Hunter, who's been a really big help for this project, the curator at the African American Art Museum, speaks so positively about it in his museum. All you see are these artifacts of that time period. But it also similarly contributed to the disinvestment and urban decay and the devaluing of the neighborhood. So this is a picture of the North Side's Hulk Homeowners Lender Corporation map. This was actually the one that was in the press of Atlantic City recently, if you all had seen that. And so as you see, again, it has the different color grades, the best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. And then, of course, the red zone was the North Side. And you know, future research, I'll tell you at the end, I'm really interested in comparing a yellow or a red zone compared with a blue or green zone today. So I've done some looking into that in terms of how they are today. So this is just a visual for you all to see the actual map. So I just wanted to show a couple pictures of the North Side. The picture on the right is a picture of a all-Black hotel staff. And then I'm sure you guys have heard of Chicken Bone Beach, which is also called Missouri Ave Beach. And if you all notice, the Sammy Davis Jr. on the left in the middle having a good old time. And again, this comes in as I teach my classes and I have my students interviewing. Everyone always mentions Chicken Bone Beach in a very loving way, and why it was created, because a lot of the hotels didn't want white tourists to see Black residents on the beach, so they gave them a small section of the beach, and that was then known as Chicken Bone Beach. Some other pictures here. I think the picture on the left was a picture of Club Harlem. So what I don't have time to go into is how booming the cultural life was there in the 1930s and 40s, similar to my research in San Francisco. And I'm sure I'm going to find a similar thing in West Philadelphia, probably on 52nd Street. But these places were booming. They had major acts come in, not like small acts come in and perform at these places. In the middle is a picture of Ralph Hunter at the African American Art Museum when I had my students last semester come visit, and we got a very special tour of the museum and all the different artifacts. Again, this is a picture of him talking about redlining in the neighborhood. And on the right is a picture of Wash's Seafood Restaurant. Has anybody ever heard of Wash's? So this was a Black-owned restaurant that was really important in the community, and it's talked a lot about in Taria Abdul-Rahim's book, if you all know. She's spoken here a few times, and she talks about the restaurant and the important place that it had in the Black community in Atlantic City. So that's also important to note as well. So the North Side today has become one of the poorest areas in Atlantic City. It also has had the highest concentration of Black residents. I'll talk about the impact of redlining in a second, but I just want to talk about the North Side very particularly. The poverty rate has ranged from 36 to 73%. And I think last time I checked about the average poverty rate is around 30 in Atlantic City, which is extremely high for a city, but even higher in the North Side. It holds about a third of the city's abandoned property, so still this legacy of disinvestment, and little to no Black-owned businesses that are remaining in the neighborhood. So it's essentially become a little bit of a shell of what once were, but people still live in the neighborhood, many of the residents that I'm still speaking with. What I wanted to do is just give a couple quotes about some of the things that I heard from residents, just to give you a little bit of the human voice inside of the story. One of the residents said, when she talked about how the neighborhood felt to her, you saw your teachers and your principals in your churches. You saw them in the neighborhood stores. You saw them everywhere you went. So it built a tighter relationship between the people in your community because you saw them in every facet of your life. The teachers, the police officers lived in your neighborhood, so you knew everybody. So Atlantic City was an awesome place to grow up. You go get your hair done, and your teacher might be there. The police chief, the fire chief lived next door to you. So people spoke very, very positively about what I call from segregation to congregation, right? It really created this hub of African American culture. One of the people that we interviewed, I thought gave a really interesting take on what redlining was to him. Now I'm going to show you how redlining goes. You ever been on Fairmount Street or Arctic Avenue? I'll take Arctic Avenue. You ever heard of Winchester Ave? There's a street Arctic, there's a street Baltic. In the Black neighborhood, it's called Baltic. You get to the same street, still in Atlantic City. When you cross over Missouri Ave, it becomes Fairmount, same street. You go a little further, when it goes into Margate and Ventnor, the same street becomes Winchester. Same street, hasn't changed, but the neighborhood's changed. So you go in to get a loan and you say you're on Fairmount, obviously the provisions that you have under that loan are different than if I say Baltic, but I'm on the same street. So I was really interested in that it discussed these kind of social boundaries, right? Also, residents knew where not to go, right? They would say, you don't go over Pacific or something like that. And even though that's not, again, written down anywhere, right, it was kind of this code that was developed there about safety and security. So it's really interesting how security and safety is being used in a couple different ways here, from the perspective of banks and from the perspective of Black residents. And lastly, I just wanted to give some voices about other ways that residents associate their lives with redlining. The first one said, when asked how their family was affected by it, he said, number one, You couldn't live where you wanted to live. You had to live where you were told to live, which was open to Black people. Oftentimes, the housing was substandard. Unfortunately, people had to live there, but they had no choice. When the laws were changed and Black people started moving into what was one time a white neighborhood, then white people started leaving the area and the neighborhood generally became all Black. So what process is he talking about? White flight, exactly. That happened more in the 50s, okay? So, you know, he talks about the condition of these neighborhoods that he moved in and then the kind of like migration change that went on, right? So when Black residents were allowed in Venice Park in 1959, Black residents moved there, white residents moved out. If you go back historically, the first school in Atlantic City was Pennsylvania Ave School, and some Black children did go to school there, but they were put in cubicles or boxes away from the other children in the classroom. So that was redlining within the school. And that was really profound when he said that, and I think that that is what got me to thinking about the difference between de jure, de facto type of segregation, because something can be, as you all know, officially outlawed, right, on paper, but in practice, residents will tell you it worked a very, very different way. And so on the paper, it could say the schools were integrated, but then you actually go and observe, do a little participant observation, and you learn that there's a different protocol that's happening. So I just want to talk about the impact and then where I'm going to take this particular work, and then I'll end. So I've been doing a lot of research of this from a lot of different sources. So these are some type of things that I've picked up that it doesn't just talk about the impact in the north side, but just redline neighborhoods in general today, so 80 years later. So we see a marked increase in segregation after the time period that redlining was officially allowed, okay? So I was going to, you guys should be proud of me, I was going to show all these maps about today and the north side and Atlantic City, but I'll spare you all. But it's really interesting how the neighborhood not only is the north side, but it's expanded up to Absecon Boulevard, right? So it's not only still there, but it's gotten even larger. And I was looking into, you know, still very high unemployment rates. We also see still lower home ownership, right? Lower property values, lower credit scores in these particular neighborhoods today. And one of the main things that people have looked at in terms of the impact of redlining is it stopping or shutting off the ability for Black families to build intergenerational wealth in these neighborhoods. So for Black families, the home tends to be the place that they have the most home equity in. So that tends to be like the place where they could turn to. But of course, as you know, with the subprime loan crisis, it affected everyone, but it disproportionately affected a lot of families of color. So it shut them down from that type of home ownership. And actually, Oliver Cook said that, our own Oliver Cook said that in the article in the Press of Atlantic City. And then, of course, it attributed to this longer-term systematic disinvestment, not only by the federal government, by the private sector, and then individual attitudes, right? So I think that the mix of those is talked about in American Apartheid a lot, a really good book to pick up that we use in urban sociology, but it's really the mix of those three things that really enforce segregation. I don't think any of those could really exist alone. And then lastly, a colleague and I published an idea, an article about discursive redlining, which is, again, looking at the ways that redlining still takes place today, even though it's not officially allowed, that we still disinvest in neighborhoods through the way that we talk about the neighborhoods, right? And I think the article was something like, just don't go down there, right? So if there are two different restaurants that are owned by someone, but one is in a shaky neighborhood and one is in a not shaky neighborhood, right? We usually tell people to go to the other one. And those type of conversations and declarations repeatedly and over time continue to lead to the disinvestment of the neighborhood today. Further work I want to look into, since this is still a very early project, the politics of gentrification as the answer, right? I mean, this has been pretty major, right? Now that the property values are low because of decades of disinvestment, right, because of redlining, and because racial attitudes have somewhat changed, right? People want to live back in the city, but who's the vulnerable population that's kind of being pushed around a little bit, right? Who was the disposable factor here? So I'll leave the gentrification question at that, and I'd like to hear from you all. So it's also creating very extremely racially and economically vulnerable neighborhoods, right? All these neighborhoods that I've been looking into express sentiments of being vulnerable or feeling disengaged or disaffected, like we talked about politically. So I kind of want to go there a little bit more. What are the sentiments of not only people living in the neighborhood today, but intergenerationally from families, because it's passed down, especially in San Francisco. Their connections to the political system due to what they went through with redlining and racial segregation is really passed down through the family. That was my next point. And then I also want to look at demographic comparisons of, like I said, higher graded neighborhoods that may be closer to Ventnor and see how they are today. I did a little bit of it the last couple days, and I am finding something really interesting, but I want to look into that a little bit more. And then I'm also, I'm working on this book on embodiment right now. I'm also really interested in value, bodies, and kind of renewal narratives with redevelopment, right? How do we save the neighborhood? That's the kind of narrative that we have with these places, but it's kind of devoid of the structural hand that was involved in creating these neighborhoods in the first place, and it paints the picture that people in these neighborhoods need saving, right? So I want to look into that a little bit more. So that's all I have for today, and thank you for letting me share some of my preliminary ideas, and I'd love to hear what you all think about it and any questions that you may have.
So my name is Alejandra, and I'm a Lang senior. And as a child, I moved to Atlantic City on Winchester Avenue, so on the south side that we just heard about.
We have to talk.
I lived 2 blocks from the beach, and I spent most of my days rollerblading around Raleigh Avenue, if any of you are familiar with Atlantic City. My dad very early on started spending his free time working with the community and pursuing his passion in journalism. And I was his sidekick, so we went to everything. We went to community events, we went to pageants, everything you can think of we went to. And we also started, when I was 12, our first local Spanish newspaper in the area, which eventually turned into an online website, and now we're looking into having both online website and newsprint, so that's in the works right now. And the Hispanic community of Atlantic City and Atlantic County has changed dramatically since 2003, since I moved there. First, it's really impossible to measure the exact number of Hispanics in the community because so many of them are undocumented. Hispanic migration is also ever-changing because of economic reasons, natural phenomena, and immigration policies. So according to Bert Lopez, who is the president of the Hispanic Alliance of Atlantic County and is also the moderator of Latino Motion, the economic crisis of 2008 really was a big driving factor in people of Hispanic descent moving away from Atlantic City and Atlantic County, as well as the Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Additionally, the current immigration climate of our country is also deterring immigrants to this country, especially in Atlantic City and Atlantic County. But we've also seen an influx of Puerto Rican migrants to the area because of Hurricane Sandy, and according to Local 54 Vice President Javier Soto, many of the casinos have employed those Puerto Ricans that moved to the area after the hurricane. So these spikes and drops in the population have to do with the types of jobs in the area. This is an area with an abundance of service jobs, and they require little education and are easy to access without documentation. Some of these include the casino industry, the restaurant business, agriculture jobs, and places like the Viking Shipyard, just a few exits away on the Parkway. However, Hispanics have a huge commerce power in the area. They own bars, restaurants, grocery stores, and many businesses, mostly in Atlantic City and Pleasantville. All of these industries exploit what I like to call the immigrant mentality, which is working hard and making money. This is also a generational mentality because it stems from why people immigrate here in the first place. I do want to point out that this immigrant mentality does not translate to the new generation of Hispanics that were either born here or came here very young, like myself. A few examples of professionals in academic jobs in this area have gone away from the, so one of the reasons why the HAC, which is the Hispanic Alliance of Atlantic County, has lost a lot of professionals in the area was because they've either moved away because of economic reasons or their ability to find professional jobs in this area. So Hispanics also have what I like to call a micro-solidarity between people of their own nations, and this solidarity is lacking in between, and it's not translated to the whole Hispanic community, leaving us in the dark politically and economically. We lack the unity to make real change because we're stuck being from here, from there, from nowhere, and we are letting others make important decisions that affect us directly. We are the second largest minority group in Atlantic City and the first in Atlantic County, yet we are not a threat at the polls. However, recently we've had a push for unity from different organizations like La Casa Dominicana and Voces Unidas por Puerto Rico and many others. I've also been pushing for the Hispanic Alliance of Atlantic County to be redeveloped. And we also created the Power of the Hispanic Vote in conjunction with the Board of Trustees Fellowship, the Stockton Center for Community Engagement, polls, and SOAN faculty that went running for 2 years to encourage Hispanics in the area and all minorities to make their voices heard at the polls. We want to get as many people to show up to community events as they do to religious events to celebrate Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. Thank you.
I'm back on, right? All right. I was struck by Christina's notion of discursive redlining. You're probably familiar with Thomas Segru's book on Detroit. And as you were speaking, I was recalling a part of the book in which he talks about car manufacturers beginning to exit the Midwest in the 1920s, at the very same time that African Americans were moving up into that part of the country for jobs. And in his papers, in the papers, one of the I guess CEOs, he was expressing concern that the communities in which these folks were moving into were becoming destabilized. What was implied, or the underlying assumption, was that the mere presence of African Americans in a previously homogeneous community is itself intrinsically destabilizing. And to me, that's a very good example of the sort of discursive redlining that you're referring to. So I thank you for that. So let me see how I do this. Okay. So let me begin these comments by defining what a sanctuary city is. And as you can see from the slide, it's not about harboring fugitives from the law, but simply refusing to serve as agents of federal immigration policy. As you know, immigration policy in this country is exclusively in the purview of the federal government. The preemption doctrine prohibits states from entering that policy domain and essentially having their own immigration policies. Whenever states do participate in implementing immigration policies, it's done through mutual agreements with the federal government. And these are Section 287G agreements. So they can't act on their own, states and localities. They can only do so in cooperation with the federal government. And here the idea is that the federal government is expecting, indeed mandating, and even withholding funds from localities if they refuse to participate in the effort to identify arrested individuals who are undocumented and hold them beyond their initial processing for ultimate detention and then deportation. So you know, these are very obviously controversial ideas. The current administration has politicized it even further. In terms of the number of sanctuary cities, it's hard to determine how many there are, how many jurisdictions there are, but a fair estimate is about 400. This includes a few states, dozens of large and small cities, and a number of counties, including some in New Jersey. An alternative approach is gaining some traction here in this state, and certainly even in Atlantic City. It is the Welcoming America, or part of the Welcoming America movement, that has about 100 municipalities that are signing on to this. Princeton's one of them, and a number of other towns and cities in New Jersey. And New Jersey has a small number that have embraced this either as a sanctuary city or as a welcoming and fair city, the monikers. Now, you may recall that the then candidate Murphy expressed support for making the state a sanctuary state, much like California. Now, there's an interesting coincidence that we're talking about this today because on this very day, the Atlantic City Council is scheduled to hold a vote on a resolution committing Atlantic City to the principles of a welcoming and fair city. I don't know the status of that vote for today. Does anyone know whether that is indeed going to happen today? According to the reporting, that's going to be on the docket for the council today. Okay. So, and that effort, by the way, is coordinated by one of Stockton's alums, Christian Moreno Rodriguez. Now, allow me to muddy the waters a little bit by further suggesting even another sort of designation, or what I call here a metaframe, Atlantic City as a gateway city. This would serve as a metaframe to encompass and link three critical organizing objectives of stakeholders in Atlantic City: adopting the principles of sanctuary cities, leveraging the dispersal patterns I mentioned before in terms of immigrants moving beyond these traditional gateway locations, and strategies for regional economic opportunity. This metaframe could minimize some of the strategic divergences that have stymied efforts on immigration reform. As I mentioned on the slide, in terms of for example, the internal factions within the Democratic Party is but one example, as well as divergent strains within communities of color that often view immigration as a zero-sum proposition. And efforts to integrate newcomers are perceived as compounding disadvantages for long-term residents if they help newcomers. That's the zero-sum proposition I referred to. Now, this metaframe that I'm suggesting of a gateway city could serve as a linchpin for strategic convergences, not divergences, but convergences, which Stockton University could play a vital role in facilitating. Convergences centered on county-wide as opposed to municipal efforts to revitalize economically, and as a mobilizing catalyst for Black, brown, white, Asian, and white coalitions that are county-wide but anchored perhaps in Atlantic City. As you know, the basis for ethnic racial coalitions in Atlantic City could be modeled on the diversity of the ancestry of immigrants that are coming to Atlantic City. Although foreign-born residents in Atlantic City are predominantly from Asian and Hispanic countries, there is a significant presence of immigrants from Afro-Caribbean, African, and European countries, and even some from Australia and New Zealand. That was interesting to learn. The idea of a gateway city is not new for New Jersey. Indeed, it has quite a history in this state. It has referred to the northeast portion of the state. We have the gateway for immigrants close by in Ellis Island. Newark was referred to as the gateway city during its revitalization. Some of you might have ridden on Amtrak's Gateway Regional Train Line or visited the Gateway National Recreation Area. And certainly, we cannot forget Stockton's own Gateway project in Atlantic City, which opens this coming fall. So just perhaps another way of proposing not only a frame, but a metaframe that allows different concerns to sort of be brought together in a way that can also mobilize people who might otherwise be somewhat difficult to mobilize. You know, I'm struck by a phenomenon that's in the Northeast, and that is, I think this is still the case, and Mike, you might correct me on this. On a per capita basis, I think New Jersey has like the highest number of municipalities. At some point, that was, I think, the case. Is that pretty close? Exactly, all right? So there is a real reticence to cooperate beyond municipal boundaries. When I was in graduate school at Temple, I had a fellowship doing research at the Assembly for Pennsylvania, so we did some studies on this in Pennsylvania as well, which has a very high percentage of municipalities. There's a real reluctance to do regional planning, which is a way of actually perhaps minimizing the gap in inequality, because you can plan perhaps more rationally, more fairly, the allocation and distribution of resources. You have more stakeholders, people that are not focused on very particular agenda items, and not being so parochial in their interests. So again, I think that could have some possibilities for strategizing and mobilizing beyond the kind of normal politics we've been accustomed to in urban politics for quite some time. So these are just some thoughts. We're very much interested in your comments, and also wanted to recommend a book based on, again, on Cristina's comments, which I just found really fascinating, in terms of the New Deal programs and how discriminatory they were towards African Americans and people of color generally, and the legacy through public policy that those policies generated. And that is a book by Ira Katznelson that you're probably familiar with, When Affirmative Action Was White. And the whole idea of that book is that government, public policy, shaped many advantages to white working class men, basically. The Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security. You might know that Social Security initially in 1935, excluded categories of employees that were predominantly in the sector of the economy in the South that was agriculture and domestic services. It took a long time to rectify that. The housing policies during that time, the GI Bill, although hundreds of thousands of men of color served in uniform during the Second World War, when they came back, they were at least formally eligible to take advantage of educational benefits from the GI Bill, not just for education, but also to get a home, to start a business, to get an education. And they were systematically either excluded from doing that or confined to historically black colleges and universities. And that obviously affects the sort of generation of wealth and equity. It gets passed down from one generation to the other, and the effects of that are still being felt. And that's being felt in this part of the country, especially in urban areas as well. The redlining was really fascinating because he also talks about the manuals that were published by the federal government that instructed the banks on the sorts of things you were describing. It wasn't just individuals in the banks that were, they had some prejudiced motivations. This was public policy, and they were following government procedure in doing this. So it's really a fascinating phenomenon that still has a legacy today. Right? So I'm going on. I broke my promise. I didn't make the promise. I'm okay.
Recommendations, but I won't make them right now. Okay, so before we move to Q&A, I want to thank the panelists. Maybe closer, turn it on. I'd like to thank the panelists for all of their sort of insightful remarks, right? You've opened up a lot of questions for us, for me, and I hope for the rest of you, that help us think about the relationship between policy, community, and activism. So that is sort of the direction that I will take us in our Q&A. But I do think that you are forcing us to think about something that many of us take for granted, right? Many of us, I would argue, tend to think of communities as being something that are sort of relatively stable or relatively unitary, right? You can point to that and say that's the community, or I have a community, or I'm trying to find a community. Communities are, as we've sort of heard, and as Dr. Jackson points out, are things that we talk about building, maintaining, saving, or renewing, as if it is the people who are members of the community that do all of that work. But all three of our panelists are calling our attention to the ways that community is shaped by other forces. So in particular, the policy choices of local government officials. So the relationship between community and policy is complex, to say the least. And so redlining, as Dr. Jackson points out, leads to segregation and devaluation, but also contributed to the creation of vibrant Black communities and thriving Black-owned businesses. Policy can help give communities the space and resources to grow and thrive and really build themselves up. But policy decisions can also, as Alejandra notes, shape our mentalities, the way we approach the world. They can shape the structures and opportunities for jobs or for political organizing. They can change the way that we think about things. They can encourage disengagement from existing opportunities, like voting. And as Dr. Rodriguez indicates, right, they can also frame the way we understand our communities and their members as either vulnerable or unwanted or welcomed and sort of cherished and valued. So by altering the rules of the game, which is how I propose that we think about policy, policies can lead communities to disperse, to disengage, and or to feel disconnected. Or maybe not. So the effects of policy can be difficult to trace. They're very hard. I applaud you all for thinking about doing that work. But it's also important to remember that the status quo, the way things are right now, is the direct result of decisions that have been made by people in the past. The way things are now does not necessarily mean that they're the way they always need to be, and policy choices, particularly around issues of immigration and housing, economics, law enforcement, et cetera, are still in flux in many ways. So as policies continue to shift, the question of who has a voice in shifting those policies and how can we use those voices effectively is one that sort of comes to the fore. So all three of our panelists have mentioned the ways that communities have begun to respond to policy changes and or policy implementations. But having considered the effects that policies can have on how communities or people in the communities engage, I would like to invite the panelists now to answer a few questions that ask them to say a bit more about how we might do that in the future. So how communities mobilize, whether they're doing so effectively in Atlantic City, and maybe what directions they might see in the future. So first, let's start here. In a highly diverse community like Atlantic City, one way for community members to affect change is to create alliances, perhaps Black-Brown alliances or alliances between other kinds of groups, that bring together people from different minority groups to press for policy change. So in your opinion, are there certain issues that we might see these alliances mobilize around, particularly in Atlantic City? Are we seeing this kind of coalition building happening already?
Well, I have to start. So yeah, you said what issues?
What issues might we see them mobilize around, and or are we already seeing mobilization around?
So I would say, so I'm newish still to studying Atlantic City. In my previous work in San Francisco, I forgot to mention to you, Black-Brown alliances were actually very strong.
Oh, yeah.
Because Bayview Hunters Point was a very small community in San Francisco that I'm not sure a lot of you probably seen. When people go to San Francisco, you don't really go to Bayview Hunters Point that much. And that actually, I was surprised to see such strong Black-Brown alliances, particularly around environmental racism of a shipyard in their particular neighborhood. I'm still newish to here, but, and Michael and Shelley can speak to this because they worked with me with BLM. I felt like it was something that was emerging there, but it still wasn't as strong. But I will say that around some of the residents that I've interviewed did a lot of work around the Water Privatization Act. And there was a lot of work that BLM helped to collect signatures along with Food and Water Watch that was cross-racial, and they were able to get it so that residents could have a vote on if they wanted their water to be privatized. It wasn't if it was going to be privatized or not. It was for residents to be able to have a vote on if the water was privatized or if it stayed public. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of residents were coming out about wanting to keep their water a public good. And so that was another place that I kind of seen a lot of that cross-racial action. But yeah, I haven't seen it as much in as big numbers as I saw in San Francisco. Hmm. Not really sure why, but I'm interested in thinking about it with you all.
I also don't see Black and Brown alliances very powerful in Atlantic City. The state takeover was one where we saw that a little bit. I know that there was an event that the past mayor of Atlantic City held last summer, which was in Spanish, orando juntos debajo de las manos de Dios, so praying under the hands of God, and there was all different kinds of churches there, English, Spanish, different religions, so that was one for the future of Atlantic City. So that was probably one of the only ones that I've been to and have been a part of.
I wonder if you could speak to maybe some of the obstacles that you see, either sort of things that were present in San Francisco that maybe are not in Atlantic City, or sort of your experiences in the Atlantic City communities and speaking to residents there.
I remember when I first came to Stockton, I was on a panel in Atlantic City, and I was struck by how vibrant and energetic but under-resourced the nonprofit sector was in Atlantic City, and how focused some of the churches were in serving and not just doing ministry. And as we all know, funding, I mean, when I did my dissertation, I was sort of struck by the fact that half of all federal, social services were funded by the federal government. And all these nonprofits, not just in Atlantic City, but throughout the country, have taken a real hit in terms of these sort of lanes of funding drying up. And that puts real strain on them, and not just in terms of operations and service, but also in collaboration with each other. And I'm struck by how recently, in the last several years, we've seen a lot of crowdsourcing for all kinds of initiatives. And I mean, I don't know Atlantic City myself either, but and folks here might be able to speak to this, whether there's any potential for that kind of activism and mobilization in Atlantic City to untether these nonprofits from the federally funded or state-funded sources of revenue, and to generate some, not just, again, in Atlantic City, but perhaps more regionally. And again, I think this sort of regional way of thinking can hold a lot of promise for community groups, for communities, for an infrastructure for mobilization, for collaboration, for thinking more innovatively. And that, I think, could have some real impact. Whether or not that's on the agenda or on the mind of folks there, I don't know. They're really under stress. When I was interviewing nonprofits in Philadelphia, I was just sort of struck again by how stressed they felt. And not only just doing their work, but not having the time to sit back. And maybe this is where Stockton could provide some help, creating spaces and venues for stakeholders in these cities to spend some time, like here, thinking and talking. And when I was doing that with my interviews, they were thanking me for the opportunity to actually explore ideas for doing things differently, collaboratively, innovatively. And if Stockton could come up with ways of facilitating, not just moments, but a sustained way of having these nonprofits, churches, social service agencies, whatever, come together and not just in Atlantic City, but I would insist it's very important to do it regionally, to do it in the county. I think that could have an impact. Crowdsourcing, collaborations, I mean, all sorts of things. They were so hungry for the opportunity to just even think and talk about opportunities to do things other than just providing the service and worrying about the budget. And I know in Atlantic City they're highly stressed. Is that something that folks have experience with the nonprofit sector in Atlantic City, the churches and the kind of service delivery they do, the kinds of issues and challenges that they're facing?
I would say the churches, definitely in my experience, have been more central than nonprofits in San Francisco. So yes, and I also think that a lot of it has to do, so a lot of the movements I study have been more neighborhood-based coalitions, and I think because of the remnants of segregation and what I was saying about a lot of these neighborhoods still aren't so integrated, and maybe Alejandra can let me know. In the neighborhood I studied in San Francisco, it was predominantly black. It wasn't any longer, but it still had the highest concentration of black residents, even though it wasn't the predominant group. So there were larger Latino and Samoan groups that were actually there. And I was like, whoa, that were actually there. And so they all felt their lives were in danger because of the shipyard. So they created these cross-racial coalitions. In a way that I'm not sure is happening as much in San Francisco, except for the takeover and the water privatization bill. But it could be because of where people are living, and maybe it's not as integrated to the level that is needed to form movements that are that. Also, I'll say that, given what I've just said about redlining, I think at least in the black community, I think it's created a very collective frame in terms of solving problems that disintegrated in the 70s and 80s to a degree, or maybe dispersed to not being so neighborhood-based. And I think that we're also, and you know, being from a social movement activist perspective, I think that Black residents should move to having a more class-based frame to these things, because that way, you know, stealing from Occupy type language, we're all affected by this, and it's all making our neighborhood and community vulnerable. And I think that that's a really powerful tool if people learn to kind of cross those bridges a little bit. And of course, there are racial ways that that's working, particularly in communities. But I think that that class-based unity is very strong and very needed for some of the things that are being faced by these communities today.
And it is very segregated when it comes to where people live. So I would say Hispanics mostly live in the 4th, 5th, and 6th ward. And another obstacle I see is the language barrier. A lot of Hispanics, for the types of jobs that they have in Atlantic City, do not need to know English. So they just never learn. My family is a great example. All of my aunts who work in the casino industry do not know English. All of my uncles who work in the casino industry do not know English. My mom's a pre-K teacher, and her English is so I think that's a huge problem for these Black and Brown alliances, because they can't communicate with each other. So how are they supposed to work together?
You've been talking a lot about divisions and barriers to mobilization, both between different groups, but also, Alejandro, your remarks within the Hispanic community as well. In an effort to sort of get us to a more positive direction, maybe, like, what could you speak a little bit more about, like, activism that you are seeing, right? Like, all three of you have talked about movements that you've seen, or policies that you've seen change, or at least voices that you've heard asking for policy change. So where is this going, or what are you pointing to, or could you point to as hopeful
Well, I mean, I think
or good models?
You know, if they take this vote today, and if Atlantic City commits to the principles of a welcoming and fair, city, and enters into discussion with other cities doing the same thing in Jersey. I think one of my slides had a number of the municipalities that are doing that here. I think going beyond a local municipal sort of mindset has a way of empowering people and making them more confident in their mobilization, and gives them more resources. And I think just acting in a broader, more expansive manner has tremendous value. And that can be leveraged for all sorts of other things. And it takes us away from being rather parochial in terms of our own interest. I mean, this is what Alejandro's talking about, that sort of is an obstacle in Atlantic City, but it's not obviously limited to Atlantic City. In San Francisco, you also saw some of that. In Chicago, I grew up in San Antonio, and there were moments where the folks of color just simply weren't working together as they should, and then a crisis will happen, and people then begin to pivot to another mode of organizing and thinking. And those are the moments in which a university, other folks can come in and begin to reshape how people are deliberating. I'm really very much into how we frame these things, because oftentimes the way in which you frame something can be very limiting. And I think that's what you're talking about in Atlantic City with some of the groups there. So how can we reframe and expand the frames that people are operating in, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're churches, municipal government? I think that's very important. I think we can be helpful in that process. But things like what's going to happen today with that vote, if they're in contact and communication with other municipalities and counties in Jersey that are doing the same thing, that puts Atlantic City on the map in a ways that it wouldn't otherwise. And I think that's important at a community level.
The thoughts?
I also think that before we have the Black and Brown alliances, the Hispanic community needs to unite, and we have seen a little bit of that happening, especially since the last year or so. We saw that with Hurricane Maria and Voces Unidas por Puerto Rico, which is an organization that brought together pretty much every group of Hispanics in Atlantic City to really work together for a common goal. And I think that's very important. And I hope to see other students from Stockton maybe take on the power of the Hispanic vote or the power of the minority vote. Since I'm graduating, I'm not going to be here to run those events or to help out. But it would be great to see other students take on that role and responsibility to engage the community and show them that they do have power, they just have to use it, and I think that's where they're failing right now.
I wonder if there's been any talk about, among high school students in Atlantic City, to be part of this broader national effort that's being initiated by high school students regarding gun control. I mean, New Jersey's not the same as other states in terms of these matters, but the idea of school safety, and again, that's an important way of framing things, because people talk about it in terms of guns, but you talk about school safety. That's something that resonates with parents, with all kinds of groups, and we're seeing a lot of activism right now in many parts of the country around this issue from high school students. Does anyone know whether this is an issue that people are talking about in Atlantic City? I don't know about that particular issue. It's so recent.
I've heard people talk about it, but I don't. So, like you said, New Jersey isn't like a big problem. I haven't heard.
Well, better gun control, but the risk of something like that happening is just
as bad.
Just as bad here.
So I haven't heard anyone be active about it, but I have heard people asking questions about it.
I was just going to say about your question. One of the movements that I've seen also come up again is the AC Residents Against the State Takeover. Has really been kind of an umbrella type of movement in organizing, but also around casino closings. I mean, this has come up. I'm always so interested when I'm doing research and I thought I'm going this way, and then this whole other issue comes up, and ethnographer me has to take that in. And for me, that's been the effect of the casino closings, and the articles published about the amount of assistance that people are applying for. Again, that's affecting people of all racial and ethnic groups and classes, and I think that has been something that has generated a very citywide concern. The casino closings, then of course the state takeover, because I think what it's done, my students have interviewed residents about this, and what it's done is it's created deep distrust and disaffection in all different types of communities, not just Black communities, feeling that their power is being taken from them, that they've put people in power locally, and now, a lot of them are saying, what does that even matter now, right? I don't have a voice, and that's one of the particular questions I've asked them, like literally it was, do you feel that you have a voice? And a lot of them feel that the state takeover has made them feel incredibly disempowered and disengaged, so having this type of attitude, well, what's the use in being a part of it anyway? But I do think that, like, especially around casino closings and them losing their jobs, as well as housing and creating more jobs, a lot of residents, I think, are really excited about kind of joining arms and trying to do something about that, creating this kind of like casino versus the people narrative I've heard. And so I think that kind of has the power to be able to shape. And of course, then you have class, socioeconomic class, which then dictates their route. So then there are some people that are like, we need to go to the board and we need to sit in these meetings and have our voices heard. And other people want more grassroots indigenous methods of being able to do that. And so I think that it needs to be solidified a little bit more. But I think those things have the potential to be able to have people organize very strongly.
Beat this drum again. I think this is an important moment of opportunity for Stockton to have a presence in Atlantic City in regards to, again, creating this kind of space for, again, nonprofits, for stakeholders to come together. And I'm sure they are as desperate here as they were in Philadelphia for opportunities to just come together and think and collaborate and hash out some of these issues across their own parochial interests. Perhaps the Hughes Center could do things along this line as well. You guys are here, so seizing the opportunities.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about all the things that you're saying, and it sounds like they are in many ways all coming back to some of the, right, like in some sense, like literally we need space,
Yeah.
which does sound like something that perhaps Stockton could provide. But, sort of thinking about constructing narratives, changing the debates or reframing the debate. So it's sort of shift in perspective, but also just like resources, right? Time, energy, people,
And
space.
that can be done in a sort of nonpartisan way that's open and empowering for people without advantaging or privileging any particular, narrow interest. I think we would do a tremendous service to Atlantic City, and we could provide, if not a pivot point, at least, resources to begin to see a different direction for all these players in Atlantic City. And I can't imagine that they wouldn't be responsive to that.
So I think we'd like to let the audience ask questions. So Dr. Abernathy will come around with a mic if you just want to.
Is it on?
No.
Okay, now it's on. Okay. So I just wanted to ask, I know I've heard a couple different opinions of us moving to Atlantic City. To go to gentrification, do you think that it is an issue for us moving to Atlantic City? Do you think there are things that we as students and faculty can do to combat the racial stereotypes that we could be kind of contributing to the community, I guess?
That's a long question.
It-
Long answer.
If we are not seriously contemplating how to respond to these issues and challenges from our presence in Atlantic City, I think we're doing everybody a disservice. Every time you have redevelopment or new infusions of capital and resources, it has that impact. It doesn't necessarily mean the displacement of people, but it could lead to that. And I think we could do a lot to minimize that. I do the Washington Internship Program, and the Washington Center opened up we got a mortgage, opened up a building for all the students to live there, and they did it in a very blighted community. And now there's all these condos and restaurants in that area, and I can assure you a lot of people that were there before are not there anymore, and their property taxes have increased, and so it pushes people out. And the people that study sociology and urban politics know when you displace people, you actually concentrate poverty in other parts of the city or outside the city. It doesn't disappear, it just concentrates it further, and then it compounds all the issues associated with that. If we don't take that into account in our planning and how we come to New Jersey and deploy our resources, soft resources and hard resources and money, we don't want to be complicit in what might happen as a result. I live in Pennsylvania in Swarthmore, and right down the road is Widener University in Chester. And they make some efforts to do things, but there is, I interviewed nonprofits there, and the resentment and the sense that, my Lord, you have this tremendous institution that's just sort of there and kind of disconnected with the rest of the community. I think everybody would agree, we do not want that to be the case with Stockton's campus in Atlantic City. I hope the provost is forgiven me for raising this.
So I guess I talked about redlining mostly today, but as you know from last class, most of my research has been on redevelopment, gentrification, and displacement through urban renewal. And so, have you all heard the term pentrification? University of Pennsylvania gentrification, and I'm a pentrifier too because I live in Philadelphia, right past
That's another
the
very good
university.
example. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and so, but I hear that we are modeling that. I hear that the Netter Center, which is like their center that they use, that we're modeling our community engagement practices off that, and I've heard really good things about that. But yes, we're definitely going to gentrify Atlantic City, and being there will change the culture of the city. And as I tell my students, when they come there, in comes the hookah bars, the cafes, and all the other overpriced movie theaters that then follow them. But it doesn't need to be in such a large effect as other places have had. And it doesn't, like Michael said, have to displace as many residents, right? There are things that we could do as a university to support that. Some of these small businesses so that they won't get shut down because the property taxes are too high. We can also hire from the community, have a local hiring quota. We can also make our building and space more available, like Michael was saying about just having a physical space and facilitators or people to like help that conversation happen. I've also heard about there being talk of a, quote, university district. That could go positive or negative, right? You know, resident has said to me that they look at that very positively, Stockton coming in there, because that light bulb and that lamp that hasn't been changed will now be changed. But it also brings more policing to the area, and then the question of policing of who, which is obviously an issue as well. And, you know, the park across the street I heard was redeveloped. Residents has wanted to happen, but you know, the issue is that there was a lot of like drug and activity there. And again, that's more displacing it. It's not getting rid of it, but it's more of displacing it. So I think that we have...
And compounding it, because where it gets displaced too, you know, Doug Massey has studied this, where, you know, you had areas of poverty, mixed communities, working class people, because of urban renewal in many places, you know, folks that were displaced go there, and then you have extreme poverty. You know, we obviously don't want that to happen, but one thing that's going to be clear is that whatever presence we have in Atlantic City is going to have consequences beyond Atlantic City proper. And again, I'm always pushing this sort of regional mentality of thinking and planning more comprehensively, which the culture for that is simply not up here to any noticeable extent. But if folks are being displaced, they're going to move to outside of Atlantic City, perhaps, and that's going to have an impact on other communities. So that has to be considered. I hope that it is.
And I also just chime in about affordable housing, which is obviously extremely important. The model usually has been mixed income housing, like Hope 6 or something like that, but that's even been very problematic because sometimes a lot of these mixed income housing still are unaffordable for residents that might be hyper-segregated or in hyper-ghetto communities. And so I think that some things sound nice on paper, but I think we need to be like very particular about how we're going to add to the culture of the city. And I'll also say lastly, and then I'll stop, but this is what I study, that Stockton isn't the first and it won't be the last to. You know, to residents, we add to the kind of institutional culture of Atlantic City, but we're not the only factor. So I think that they have a lot of hope and promise in Stockton and what we'll bring. And I've only heard very positive perspectives from community residents, but I don't know if they're thinking kind of in this more longer term, right? We should be aggressively recruiting from Atlantic City High School, right? And that's what we've been trying to do with the CLCE concentration is how about we be an anchor institution and recruit from the high schools, educate Atlantic City High School kids, and send them back into the community to stay and reinvest back in and be leaders of their own community. Sorry, I didn't mean that to be an advertisement for CLCE, but it was so fitting.
Well, since we're doing shameless advertising, we can do internships. Internships.
And I think as students, we also have a big role in Atlantic City, being involved in the community, especially if you are taking classes or living there. I've heard a lot of people say they're scared to be in Atlantic City, which I think is a little ridiculous, maybe because I live there. But it's not really a scary place, and like I've been in Stanley Homes Village, and I've done homework with the kids, and those are the kind of things that you need to be doing if you want to be part of the community, which Stockton is going to be. So I think being mindful of the opportunities that Stockton has to be involved, to take advantage of them. Oh, and Jesse will be teaching an immigration course, which will also be teaching the naturalization classes for the Stockton Center for Community, which we taught before together. So.
Which you found.
Yes, but I'm old now, so I'm leaving.
So I need people to take the class and help community members.
And take my classes.
The sewing program will mostly be in Atlantic City, so if anyone is looking for sewing classes, there's a way to get involved in the city.
We're teaching there in the fall.
Other questions? Oh, right.
And I'll also plug the minor, just because it's also going up for a vote soon. Now I'm just going to take over. because that's what I do now. My name is Jessie Finch. I'm an assistant professor of sociology, and I'll be in Atlantic City in the fall and spring, and I'll be doing these classes for the community. That's also classes for students who want to help be a part of that. And so I study immigration issues as well, and one of the things that we're doing next Tuesday, February 27th at 4:30, is that we're bringing in attorneys from Rutgers Law School, and we're looking at issues around migration status. So if you know someone who has legal questions about migration status issues, and we also have people who are doing a clinic on domestic violence issues. So if you know people who have legal questions about that or just are interested in it personally and want to know more about the legal aspect of those things, especially with the migration laws changing literally every day, there's a lot to keep up to date with. So having some professionals come in and work with students. And so these kinds of activities that we're trying to integrate, community and students and different players so that there isn't as much gentrification or studentification, which is another term for it, with universities coming in. So that's my plug.
Jesse's also involved with a few of us in putting forward a proposal for a migration studies minor that would have also, obviously, a direct link to what's going on in Atlantic City. So I think tomorrow you'll be presenting on our behalf, right?
Yeah, that's for the subcommittee. So if anybody's on the Senate subcommittee, you can vote for our minor.
We're getting really shameless here, but
If it fits.
Yeah, I'm not so much with the subtlety.
I guess I will just add to our shameless plug. So again, but speaking of like changing the narrative and creating spaces, that is, those are the next steps in the Political Engagement Project's Engage Atlantic City series. So again, this is exactly the kind of conversation that we are hoping to start with these events. So the next one that's coming up is not till April. March is a busy month, not just because of spring break. So on April 9th from 6 to 7:30 in the Campus Center Theater, we will be screening a PBS documentary, Voices of from Atlantic City, and we will be hosting a similar panel discussion that engages these kinds of questions of economic revitalization. How do we do that without gentrifying? How do you gentrify in a way that is productive? While also keeping alive these complex questions of race and ethnicity, of class, of gender, that our panelists have raised so eloquently tonight. So then on March 17th, which is a Tuesday, we have two sessions. April 17th, which we have two sessions of a deliberative dialogue. So we are creating space for different stakeholders to come together and discuss the issue of public health in Atlantic City. So we have materials that are created by Stockton students who have worked alongside the Boys and Girls Club of Atlantic City to create different ways of thinking about public health in the community. And then we'll have two sessions, one from 10:30 to 12:30 and one from 12:30 to 2:30, where we just discuss those in a facilitated dialogue. So we hope that you will join us for some or all of these events. We definitely hope that you continue these conversations both amongst each other and with other people who aren't here today as we sort of close for the day. Oh, and also, finally, we have a survey that we'd love for you to fill out if you have the time. We are just assessing how well we're doing at this kind of thing. But with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for a really great discussion.